I guess what I do to prepare as an actor is I just imagine each character from childhood, all their experiences that they've had. And with Beverly and Elliot, they've probably experienced a lot of things together because they've never lived apart and they've been together since the womb. But they both experience things very differently. So once you sort of have a character inside you, they just naturally start to use language differently or have different gestures or look at people differently. But once I'm working between action and cut, I'm not conscious of any of it. So I don't know, like I'm not conscious of tone, or I just think I'm that person.
Welcome to the SAG-AFTRA Foundation's Conversations at Home program. I'm Angelica Jade Bastién, a critic at New York Magazine's site Vulture. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the star of Dead Ringers, Rachel Weisz. Rachel, thank you so much for making time to talk to me today.
Oh, thank you for doing the same thing, Angelica. It's lovely to be speaking to you.
Oh, that's sweet. I get to brag about it, but you don't really get to brag about talking to me, but I can brag about talking to you.
I know that. I'm going to brag.
So I want to start off with a somewhat selfish question. I listened to your appearance on the Intuit podcast, and you mentioned one of my favorite actors of all time, Bette Davis, who herself played twins twice in her career, once in the 1940s with A Stolen Life, and then a second time in the 1960s with, funny enough, a film called Dead Ringer, no relation to this Dead Ringers. And Bette Davis has a really interesting ethos that she liked to say behind her acting and kind of what powered it and her thought process behind her work, which was that acting should be bigger than life. And I always thought that was a really fascinating kind of belief system for an actor to have. And I was just wondering, do you have a personal ethos that you kind of keep close to your heart when it comes to your acting? Or do you adjust your belief system depending on what the role calls for?
What a great question. I mean, the thing that it made me think that acting should be bigger than life in relation to Dead Ringers is that story should be bigger than life.
Yes.
Definitely this story of Dead Ringers, even though it begins in a recognizable naturalistic world of a hospital, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I feel like Alice Birch's writing and the other writers managed that by it beginning very grounded, that then it could get bigger and bigger and more heightened. And the imagination, the human imagination of these writers it becomes so big. It becomes so, I mean, for me, we're like entertaining and wild and mad and bananas and operatic. But with acting, we're talking about acting. I guess I had to meet the writing as a performer. So what was wonderful about this show was that it is naturalistic and detailed and authentic, but I definitely had to go to incredibly extreme big places. But I don't have a theory of I don't have a Bette Davis theory. I wish I did. I'm going to come up with one. I'm going to think of one.
You should. I think it's kind of fun to think of like a propulsive thematic force for your own work. Like I have one, which is mine is pleasure is my discipline. That is kind of how I think of things.
Love that. I love that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And this is really definitely a show that deals a lot with pleasure and desire and women's desires and giving these characters the space to be big, like you're saying, to have a boldness to them. And one thing I was thinking about throughout watching it, I've seen now the series backward, like all the way through 3 times, I think, at this point. And one thing that I was really struck by in terms of both the writing and your performance was the tonal dynamics of the show, because it can be darkly humorous, it can be heartbreaking, it can be very lush and evocative. And I was wondering, for you as a performer, how do you balance tone when it comes to playing characters that vary so much, but making it feel like it's still of a piece? It never feels so outlandish that it kind of breaks the suspension of disbelief. And this balancing of tonalities is really interesting to me. So how did you do that as a performer?
I'm going to go back to the writing again, because the writing is so great that, well, let me start again. I don't think, maybe this is my Betty Davis theory of acting, I don't think you can act tone, or at least I don't know how to. I don't know how to act in a tone. Like, I'm acting in a comedic tone or a thriller or a tragedy or a dramedy. I don't know how to do that. For me, it's just, I mean, the camera is right there and it sees it right into you, and you can't, I don't know how to like maneuver myself as if I have like a gear shift stick.
Yeah.
I can't like go, oh, this, it's just got to be real. It's got to feel like it's really, really happening. And I think you can't, I think the camera sees if you don't feel it. It just,
yeah.
So for me, it's always just, I just believe it. So yes, in this writing, what's delicious about this writing is that it doesn't stay within one, even genre, I guess. You know, it's a thriller, it's a love story, it's a tragic, so for me it's just about feeling that the character is completely real, and the shift of tone is not something that I'm aware of. I guess in our real lives we shift tone all the time, right?
Oh yeah.
Right, we feel, you know, we have an intimate moment with a partner, and then we have a professional moment with someone, and then we have I don't know, I think we're tonally going through all different kinds of tones of reality. So yeah, the writing just led me to all these different tones, and hopefully they all feel authentic.
They definitely,
not conscious.
Interesting. That's really interesting to me. I definitely feel like, because everything feels authentic in the writing, you are really carried along this journey in a way that feels real, and also feels like all the decisions tonally feel natural. It doesn't feel like y'all are just kind of throwing something wild in there just to do so. But that brings me to another question, which is, you know, when it comes to maybe one scene in particular that you really loved in the script, but weren't sure about if you could actually pull it off as a performer, was there any scene like that had you both daunted and very excited to get on the set and perform? Like any one of the scenes, because there's lots of dinner scenes that I imagine were also tricky technically to do with the characters, like the one that in episode 2 at Rebecca Parker's sort of estate with the family, like kind of hearing about, you know, a scene that was daunting but exciting, and how that translated once you got to set.
I mean, definitely the dinner scenes, the one in episode 2 with the Parkers, with, I don't know, 10 people around the table, and having to start with Beverly, who is really put through the ringer. She's having a terrible, terrible time trying to be a good girl and get money from this family. And then play out. Yeah, the dinner party scenes were, I mean, everything was technically very challenging, just from 2 characters in the same scene. Trying to think, like, I think there was one, a C-section scene that ended up not being as long as it was on the page, but where I had to be Beverly and Elliot having repartee extremely whilst delivering a baby in a C-section. So it was just lots of different things happening at the same time, really complicated dialogue. It was very fast paced, very rat-a-tat-tat, and technically trying to be believably like delivering a baby in a very high stakes situation because it's an emergency C-section. I would say that was the most like scene, right at the edge of everything that it was a massive challenge. Yeah. That's the mind.
And one thing I really loved about your performance is your physicality as a doctor is very convincing, which isn't to say I know many doctors, but hey, I completely bought it. Especially like there's a scene where you're turning a baby around while it's still in the womb. And I thought that was interesting. How did you prepare and research the aspect of the characters, being a doctor, understanding the physicality and thought process of being an OBGYN? And how did that research feed into your performance?
Yes. And actually, that's another scene that you just mentioned that was very challenging because it's physically hard work to turn a baby. And it was something that I watched doctors do. I watched lots of YouTube videos of doctors turning babies, and we had obstetricians on the set who were telling me if I was doing something wrong. I actually shadowed some obstetricians and watched deliveries, and I spent a lot of time with them and in real hospital settings. And then they were on the set with me, which was fantastic because they would just tell me so many stories. It was the best preparation that continued right the way through the shoot because they were there as in between takes. We just sat and had a coffee and a chat, and they were telling me stories from their lives, which was incredible. But yeah, physically turning a baby and looking like you've done it 1,000 times or something, whilst losing your temper with the patient who's not the woman, who's not the surrogate, but the mother in the scene. I mean, yeah. Very demanding. I can't remember what your question was now. How did I prepare for it?
Yeah, just how did you prepare and like research this aspect of the Mantles' lives, being a doctor and, dealing with that sort of physicality?
Yeah, just being with doctors, watching them work. And then the physicality of turning a baby, it is what it is. It's very physical work. I wasn't pretending it was hard work. It was a prosthetic belly and there was a prosthetic baby inside, but to physically turn it was, like a workout. I think I got stronger, bigger muscles.
One thing I noticed very early on, actually probably in that first scene that you see the Mantles in the diner, was Beverly and Elliot's very different approach to language. Elliot really likes to deal with words in a luscious manner and sometimes really draws them out, versus Beverly, who has a more demure relationship with language, also often is looking down when she should be looking directly at a person. And I was really curious, how did you figure out the overlap and differences in how the twins approach language and actually speak?
Well, it's so fascinating to hear you say that. I'm not aware of that as a performer. I guess what I do to prepare as an actor is I just imagine each character from childhood, all their experiences that they've had. And with Beverly and Elliot, they've probably experienced a lot of things together because they've never lived apart and they've been together since the womb. But they both experience things very differently. So once you sort of have a character inside you, they just naturally start to use language differently or have different gestures or look at people differently. But once I'm working between action and cut, I'm not conscious of any of it. So I don't know, I'm not conscious of tone, or I just think I'm that person between action and cut. So all the work goes in before, but it comes sort of inside out. It's your imagination that then creates, you get the incredible writing, you work on it, you speak, you say it on your own. And then once you're performing, it's no longer, you're not really aware of what you're doing anymore. It's just the characters there. Does that sound like that? Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's always interesting talking to actors, because I think acting, out of all the aspects of filmmaking and that sort of process, acting is the most ephemeral. It's the hardest to put into words, like what an actor is doing. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of what you're doing is like an unconscious, like muscle work. Like, you know what you're doing. You've been acting for a long time. It's almost like a second nature. It's like a physical, like, movement you understand how to do. You don't necessarily intellectualize it the way, say, I would as a critic, which makes sense. You don't want to over intellectualize everything you're doing, because that can lead to very stilted, kind of rigid work.
Yes. And I love what you just said. You just said unconscious muscle work. Did you?
Yeah.
It's unconscious muscle work. You've done your muscle work before with your imagination. But then between action and cut, I don't even know what the character's going to do. They might just, I don't know what they're going to do. They're in charge. And yeah, if you get into your conscious mind, then, well, if I get into my conscious mind, I'm screwed. Like, totally. Yeah. So it is very unconscious. Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. That brings up a question I had, which was, how much rehearsal time did you get before shooting started?
None. We didn't do any rehearsal. The only thing we did, we rehearsed the technical, rehearsed the technical side of having one person play two people in one scene. So I worked with Kitty Hawthorne, my scene partner, and yeah, we had a technical rehearsal.
Do you prefer to have more rehearsal time, or do you kind of like figuring it out, or kind of bringing to bear all the thought process on set rather than going through a rehearsal for a show like this?
I mean, I think there's probably advantages to both ways, and it depends on the director. So some directors, they need to rehearse for their process. So I'm happy to do it. I'm also really happy to not have any rehearsal, or what I call it is to rehearse on camera, which is my favorite thing, because I feel like it's all a rehearsal. I mean, every take can be like radically different to the last, and I tend to go lots of different directions. And yeah, I would always say that to Sean Durkin, who directed the first 2 episodes and co-directed the last one. I would be like, yeah, let's just rehearse on film, just it's all a rehearsal. And that can be exciting and dangerous and scary, but can prove good things could come of it. And then great things can also come of having rehearsal with the other actors. They're just different processes, and I can make both work.
That's a sign of a great actor. I don't know how y'all do it, but y'all do. And you mentioned Sean Durkin. I'm a huge fan of him as a filmmaker. And you also have Karen Kusama directing an episode. You have some really, really great directors. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about working with different directors on the same project in the same world, and how working with such like amazing, astute, visually rich directors influenced your performance on set, day of, or just maybe helped you recalibrate things. I'm just really curious about the director acting process in this project.
Yes. It was Karina Evans and Lauren Walkstein as well. So, I mean, the first 2 were with Sean, and he's a very hands-off director. It's almost like he's making a documentary or something. He's very like, just puts the camera up and he's very light touch as a director. Incredibly, has made quite a lot of dark content, but he's a very not dark person. He's very sweet and kind and gentle, and just lovely. And then Karina Evans came and did episode 3, and I think she was 26 when we.
26. That's so
cool. Yeah. But she's like the soul of a, much older. She's an old soul, and she was just incredibly, also very gentle, but very rigorous, and her own visual style, a lot of flair. She's made a lot of music videos as a child. She was probably in her early 20s, and she was an actress. And so she really understands the acting process. But it's strange, because I've never had that experience of moving from one director to another. It's like changing parents or something mid flow. It's like suddenly you have like a new mom and dad.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then Lauren Waldstein, who did episode 4, and that was Genevieve and Beverly's love story, and she was very invested in that story, and she had a lot of romance. She loved the kind of romance of that story. And then Karen, who made this kind of Southern Gothic horror, like mad bananas, almost like a standalone film. I feel like it's just she's extraordinary, Karen. Like just. But she's a very experienced director, so she did a ton of coverage every day, and just really joyful, really knows what she's doing. She was a great mom. Fantastic. Yeah, but it was a very new experience to be the same characters but have a different leader. I really loved it. I really loved the variety of points of view.
That sounds very exciting. It also makes me wonder, do you notice much of a difference working with a director who's also done acting?
I really noticed it with Karina Evans. I noticed it with her. Yes. I could tell when she would come and give me a note, I could see her like feeling it from the inside, and just the words that she used. Take a breath, and I could see she was feeling the feeling, and then when she used an adjective, it was like right on. It was exactly what I think had been happening, and then she was very descriptive about how she wanted it to proceed. And actually, there was one scene where it's the scene in episode 3. Well, it was her episode, where Elliot pushes the lady who doesn't have a home over the balcony, who lives on the street, and I was carrying on being Elliot, having fun, and she just kept gently saying to me, "I don't think Elliot's enjoying this anymore. I don't think it's fun anymore." And I was like, yeah, I think she is, because it was Elliot was trying to hold on, and she just very gently directed me to actually a 180 from where I was. But she did it really, really gently. But she was insistent in a very gentle way, and she was completely right for the story. Yeah.
So one thing that is very noticeable difference between the twins is some hair and costuming choices. And I was curious, how did costuming and makeup and hair inform your performance and approach to the twins?
Yeah. So, yes, they, I mean, the hair we thought of really early on. We just thought Lily's a little more uptight, and so she has her hair in a bun and a center part, which is more kind of, I guess, serious center partings. I have a center parting, I don't know. And then Elliot has a side part, and her hair's down, and so she's a bit more free and or her relationship to pleasure is very relaxed. She's relaxed about it. And then the costumes, it just became clear really quickly what Elliot would wear, what Beverly would wear, they actually had different underwear. I know that's weird, but like,
but that's important. Like wearing different kinds of underwear, I think affect how you like even sit up and like move. So that makes sense.
Yeah, so we did. So I would change. It was a full change: underwear, outerwear, shoes. Yeah, it just became very clear, like what would be a Beverly look and what would be an Elliot look. And yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Nice. So one of my final questions to you is to hear from your perspective how you define Beverly and Elliot's very different relationship to desire and pleasure. Because I think that's central to the differences between them, where like Elliot heeds pleasure. She like goes straight for it, like just rushing headfirst into whatever thing, food item, she eats a lot in the show, or whatever like brings her pleasure. And Beverly is a very different relationship. And I'm just curious to hear your thought process on their different relationship to pleasure and intimacy and desire, and maybe how that affected your physicality with the characters.
Yeah. Well, again, the physicality came from something on the inside of when my imagination had worked on the characters for a long time, and I found them, the physicality, came from their characters. So Elliot's character, she's has an uncomplicated relationship to pleasure. She wants something, a burger, a man, a clothes. Like for her, it's like she just wants something, she gets it, she enjoys it, and then she goes on to the next thing. She doesn't have it's really uncomplicated for her, and she's restless. So I guess that meant that she was probably always kind of moving around a bit, like as if there was sort of music playing in her all the time or something. She had some like dance track playing inside of her. I'm sort of doing it now. She's just like always, she's restless and like hungry, and insatiable, I guess. And actually nothing on the outside world will really ever satisfy her, because it's Beverly. That's her whole life is Beverly. She lives for Beverly. She loves Beverly. She will do anything for Beverly. And then for herself, she can just kind of get whatever she wants when she wants. But her emotional center and her psychological base is Beverly. Beverly has a really complicated relationship to pleasure. She's denied herself pleasure. She would like to get away from Elliot secretly. Like she would like to have a relationship apart from Elliot, but she feels so guilty about that want that she's sort of tortured. She's tortured and paralyzed and crippled by wanting to go, but also knowing that she has to stay, and she worries about everything. She doesn't like pleasure, really. She struggles with it, and she's on a kind of crusade for women, and she really cares about them. And I think she's a brilliant doctor, brilliant caring doctor. I think Elliot's a brilliant scientist, but I think Elliot more wants the glory. I don't know, I'm really rambling there, but
no, this is like super fascinating to me, because it's like it's allowing anyone who watches this a window into kind of your thought process, like how you thought through the characters, connected to them, understood them, and you show a really remarkable sense of understanding of these women. I think another performer could have easily made Elliot too broad and Beverly too small and quiet, but there's such complication and intriguing overlaps between the characters because of your performance. I think this show, like, I'm very particular about television, and one thing I always say is it's very rare actually to see a show be cinematic in terms of how the camera moves, but also what the acting is doing. And I think you and your collaborators really do an amazing job with this show. But I have just a little bit more to ask you. One episode I really liked that you mentioned briefly is episode 5, which has like that very powerful dream like scene that feels cut from a horror movie, where Beverly is being told about the enslaved women being experimented upon by Dr. J. Marion Sims, who gained the moniker of the father of gynecology. For people who don't know, it's a very messed up history. And in the sequence, you're being talked to it, but you don't really say anything. And I really was curious to hear about filming this scene and your ability to communicate Beverly's internal complications without a lick of dialogue. And just, can you talk about that scene? Because it's very much stands out in the show in a lot of ways. And I found it really fascinating. Just want to hear how you played that.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned in our research, we learned about J. Marion Sims, the father of American gynecology, who's so part of the present to the point where it's inside of language. Like there's the Sims position, which is a examination position where a woman's on her side. So it's everywhere. And Alice Birch, the showrunner, always knew that she wanted to have his story and the history of his story as part of the show. And so she gives Anarcha, who was one of the enslaved women that he operated on without anesthetic. And that's all we know about her was her name, Anarcha. We don't know anything else about her. And so Alice wrote her the most extraordinary, I think 3-page monologue, and it was filmed inside of a black box. It's a kind of dream space. It is a dream space. And it has it has a sort of sense of theater. It's an empty black space. And Beverly is confronted by this woman from history who tells her, I'm sort of getting goosebumps talking about it, because the way Alice wrote it, it's like a kind of incantation. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's it's a voice of history telling Beverly, this is this job that you do, the man who's the founder of it, this is what he did, and this is what he did to me. And so I just listened, I guess, is my answer to your question. Beverly just listened. And for Beverly, this is, well, for any human being, this would be a horrifying and just completely shocking thing to learn about. We decided that Beverly didn't know. And there are gynecologists that I've met in America who didn't know who J. Marion Sims. A lot probably do know, but because she's British, we decided, okay, she doesn't know. So she's learning something new, and this is her profession, and she's hearing about the underbelly, the history, the origin story of this job that she does. And so I was just listening, and she's, shaken to her core. I don't know what she would have, there was nothing to say. She just had to listen and witness and absorb. And I don't know what she could have even, I don't know. So I just listened, and I listened to extraordinary acting and writing.
Yeah, definitely. I think being a good listener is incredibly hard, not just for regular people, but also actors. There's sometimes you can tell when an actor is waiting to speak versus actually just being in the flow of the scene. But you're really good at being in the flow of the scene and like doing what a scene calls for, but also surprising viewers. So I want to say thank you so much for making time to speak with me today. It was fascinating hearing your perspective as an actor. On behalf of the SAG-AFTRA Foundation, I want to thank you for sharing your experiences, process, and craft with your fellow performers, Rachel.
Thank you, Angelica. Thank you for so many great questions, and thank you for the lovely things that you said about my performance. But I have to say that it all comes from great writing. Anything good that happened, it comes from great complicated writing and an incredible group of directors and heads of departments. So it was such a beautiful collaboration between a really large group of people. But thank you.